But I'm coming to you from the trout fire in New Mexico, and that's near Silver City. And I wanted to lead with a shout out to the great fuel model work that has been done with the LANDFIRE program since it started in 05 when I was the LANDFIRE fuels team lead. They've come a long ways. But I wanted to share with you a few insights I've gained over the last day or so, talking with the fire behavior analysts and some of the long-term analysts that have provided some great insight for me on this fire. One of the things they're finding down here is the timber litter models and anything dealing with forested environments has been working very well. So kudos to that. In the non-forest environment, it's been 50-50, and the general critique has been that LANDFIRE continues to overestimate the amount of herbaceous material in the non-forest environment. But other than that, it has been, from what I can see, an overwhelming success looking at the fire behavior predictions. And if you don't understand what happens when there's an incident like this, one of the first things that people will do when they decide whether they want to actively engage the fire, and if so, what kind of resources might be needed, they're going to have to make some pretty rough calculations pretty fast to determine how big the fire might be if no suppression activities are coordinated. And it became apparent early on at 99th percentile ERC values here in the Southwest, been extremely dry. A lot of the shrubs were in the neighborhood of 65 to 75% live fuel moisture, which is very low, not historically low, but very low. They realized early on, using LANDFIRE data, they were able to determine very quickly that this fire would grow and threaten property and values that we care about. And that's what brought on the complex incident management team that's here right now. So I thought I'd share with you, for those of you that don't follow that sort of thing, what the LANDFIRE data are so valuable for. But today, we're going to talk about non-forest environment. So basically anything on the map that is in yellow is fair game for discussion. And part of that is because a lot of the work we do is remote sensing based and we can't see through the trees, so we just leave it alone. The main tools we're going to cover, some more than others, would be the Rangeland Analysis Platform, or RAP. And if you want to know more about that, it's Agricultural Research Services, the owner. Sarah McCord is the colleague that you'll want to contact. It is absolutely game-changing. The data that go into the Rangeland Analysis Platform have really changed our ability to model fuels and fire behavior across the West. Also, the Rangeland Production Monitoring Service, that's our own tool where we look at those herbaceous dynamics and try and make educated guesses about probable fire spread and fire behavior using that. Moving down to invasive annual grasses, or IAG. Some of you may know about that already, but that's a USGS product. You're going to want to contact Matthew Riggy through USGS at Aeros Data Center. That is a really fantastic product, and you're going to get an update about every 12 days, plus or minus, in terms of estimates of invasive annual grasses across the sagebrush biome. And that's foliar cover. And we also use that, and we'll talk more about this, to dial up or dial down the surface fire behavior field models based on our expectations of fire behavior in relation to that product. It's really fantastic if you haven't looked at it. Now, one of the key things we're going to talk about too is fuel thresholds. What I mean is there's a level of herbaceous production where fires won't occur, large wildfires. And we definitely saw on this fire here in the trout fire areas that the estimates of fire behavior were more in the lines of GR2-ish. So you're looking at 100, 200, 300 chains per hour type of behavior expected based on those fuel models. What we found after field reconnaissance is that the herbaceous production has been very low in the area because of the drought they've been in. No surprise. But there's some thresholds that I want to share with you we're finding where large wildfires probably won't exist. Then we're going to talk about how LANDFIRE has aided in our carbon accounting for above ground carbon in the shrubs, and also the 110, 100, and 1,000 hour fuels. Those are different size classes of fuels. And without LANDFIRE data, there is no way we would be successful in that endeavor. And I'll show you how in just a bit. We'll then lead with the 7-layer cake approach, but we're only going to talk about those components that I think that are of interest to the crowd today, looking at the fuels primarily. And if you don't know what that means, you can tune into Reading the Tea Leaves. We talk a lot about the 7-layer cake, which is basically a mashup of information to talk about where we expect large wildfire activity to occur. Then we'll also touch a little bit on how we use all of this information to adjust those surface fire behavior field models, much the way ModFIS does. But I think we have a sharper emphasis on the herbaceous production, not only what happened last year for standing dead, but also what's going on right now in the growing season. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, talking about how you bring all of this together into a decision support context that we can use to plan field treatments. So I want to talk first about the 7-layer cake. And again, this is where we evaluate fuels across the Western U.S. and how they're changing in the growing season and how we expect that to impact fire behavior. And we start with curing. And curing is simply, how fast or how slow is the green, let's just say the green vegetation turning brown, if that makes sense to you, especially in the herbaceous domain. Enough said about that. And you can contact me if I say something and go over it, which today is all about mustard seeds, sharing ideas with you that I think will work if we apply them together. So if you want to learn more about any of these elements, let me know. We'll talk about it. Also, we use SPEI, which is a standardized precipitation evaporation index, 6-month and 12-month varieties, because they affect the live fuel moistures differently. And this is actually data from about the middle of May this year. You can see the Southwest was in extreme drought. That's changed with the several inches of rain that have occurred, especially in New Mexico, over the last few days. Very importantly, and this is where one of the Rangeland tools comes in, the Rangeland Analysis Platform. If we only have herbaceous material, will we have a long-lasting fire? Let's just say a field of cheatgrass. No, because it blows out. I mean, the fire just burns through, and that's it. But what if we have shrubs and trees intermixed with those herbaceous fuels? That's where we get long-lasting fires and big problem fires that burn very hot. So one of the things we look at is how the ratio of herbs to woodiness changes over time. And you can do that using the Rangeland Analysis Platform. This is a picture of that scenario, the wood, let's call it, where we added tree cover and shrub cover to give us a picture of larger diameter fuels. These are just easy, quick glances of what's going around the Western U.S. in terms of fuel. So this is from 2024. But why would we want to evaluate woodiness? Shrubs last a long time, and so do trees. Why do we need to look at it every year? Because we have large wildfires that punch through those fuels and completely change that dynamic. So think about what happened in Eastern Oregon this year with all the sagebrush. We lost about 5% of the sagebrush communities in Eastern Oregon. 5% of the existing sagebrush was torched last year in all those fires. That's going to totally change your viewpoint of shrub cover there, or at least it should. So that's why every year we need to reevaluate the woody component. Some of you may not be familiar with the Rangeland Analysis Platform. We don't actually use the web app. But what we do is we use the data from the Rangeland Analysis Platform on Google Earth Engine to tell us something about the fuels and how they change over time. For example, on the left-hand side, we see the trend in tree cover. Blue tones or cool tones tell us areas where over time, trees have been increasing. And in this case, it's mostly PJ and mostly J. So the juniper species are primarily responsible, especially in the southern edge of the Kaibab National Forest. We're seeing tremendous encroachment by juniper, and that's readily identifiable in the Rangeland Analysis Platform. On the right-hand side, we see IPNF. That is the Idaho Panhandle National Forest. Recently, in fact, in the last 3 weeks, we've been evaluating grazing permits, not only for their to keep them up to be current. The administration, as you might know, is encouraging active management, which generally means reevaluating grazing permits and determining if the permits that were written, let's say in the 1970s, are still valid. So we see on the X time, on the primary y-axis, PFG cover, that's perennial forb and grass, the blue dots, what's happening? Going straight down. Early 80s, we had a lot of grass. Fast forward to today, almost none. What about the trees? Tree cover, secondary y-axis. It's going straight up. So let's get this right. The herbs are going down, the trees are going up. That has implications not only for the livestock, but also for fire behavior. The surface fuels are being choked out by the trees. If any of you visited Idaho Panhandle National Forest, you know what I mean. There's not a lot going on in the understory in many cases. And this graph and the Rangeland Analysis Platform demonstrates it very well. So I want to talk about one of the things we focus more on than anything else when we talk about fire behavior and changes to fire behavior expectation. So this is the herb yield change, both in 2024 and what's happened to date in 2025, compared to the long-term average. A couple of things, what do we know? Take a look at southern New Mexico. It's a total wipeout. It's dusty. There's not much of an herb response. And ditto with West Texas. We can plainly see that in these remotely sensed data. So what might that mean for fuel models in southern New Mexico? You would want to, decrease the expected fire behavior correspondingly. And you ask, what's the white? The white is either going to be tree cover greater than 25% because we can't see the herbs, or it's ag, or it's urban, or something else. But suffice to say, we need to be looking at areas where, if we want to understand where we expect fires to pop, we want to find areas where we see increases of 50% or greater year over year. And that fire that just happened in Reno, south of Reno, just a little bit ago. Take a look at south of Reno. So the elbow in Utah on the west, or Nevada on the west end, on the west side. You see a lot of dark blues. That means the herbaceous response in that neck of the woods is way bigger than normal compared to a 40-year average. So this kind of herbaceous change is critical for modeling expected fire behavior going into the future. But do we just care about the percent change? No, because if I double my herb yield and I'm in the Southwest, so let's say the southeastern or southwestern corner of Arizona, see a lot of greens and blues down there. That means as a percentage, things are really moving. There's a lot more herbs than normal. Yeah, but it still only is about 200 pounds per acre. So do we really expect a lot of fire behavior there? No. So that's why we have to bring in the total fine fuel. And I'm happy to share any of these layers with you, and you can do your own, let's call it alchemy for the fuels. This is total fine fuel in pounds per acre, 2024 standing dead plus 2025. And cool tones tell us areas where the herbs are much more productive. Many of you understand this intuitively, but we want to find areas where we've got 800 pounds per of herbaceous content or more. That's a little conservative, as we'll see in just a little bit. But I think 800 pounds is a good place to start your discussion with fire behavior folks. And we have evidence that shows us that. And I'll share that with you in just a bit. Invasive annual grasses. Again, this is from 2025, about May 5th from USGS. Cool tones tell us areas where the invasive annual grasses are much higher. Take a look at Eastern Washington. That cool tone there, yeah, that's ground zero for cheatgrass hell. And ditto into the Columbia River Gorge. Any of you familiar with that country knows it burns every year. They've had 3 or 4 fires there this year. They're not long lasting because the shrubs have all burned. And they're just flash in the pan, 50,000 acres, and it's over. And that's because of these invasives. So for our fuel modeling applications, we want to find areas that have greater than or equal to 25% cover by cheatgrass. Why do I choose 25%? It's a very good question, and I don't have an answer. But it's something I've had a feel for over time. You kind of have to calibrate your fuel estimated fire and fuel response based on what the data are telling you, not necessarily what is real on the ground. In other words, if there are biases in the invasive annual grass data, and let's say that it's always lower than in reality, well, then you can adjust your threshold accordingly, knowing that. These data are not perfect, but I encourage you to check this out from USGS. One of the final layers we use is where fires have occurred. We used to think early on, years ago, that if we had a lot of wildfire, it would punch through the fuel and there would be less fuel to burn, and that is true. But it's also true that if we had fire in the past, we'll probably have fire in the future. So we use it primarily to tell our 7-layer cake that, hey, you're likely to have fire here more so than other areas. Take a look at central Idaho, for example. That is a lot of fire. So this is 84 to 2024. That is a lot of wildfire on the landscape, and this can be a guide for what may happen in the future. So we add all these things up, and it gives us an idea of where we think the needle might begin to move this year. So last year, mid-May, this was that mashup. So we had a series of binary maps. You either meet the threshold or you don't. And if you have 7 indicators and you have a score of 7, that means all of the indicators were increasing probability of large wildfires. What's the main thing you notice from this? Take a look at Southern California. Those big purple blobs are almost identical to the Palisades and Eaton fire, and I will show you some more of that in just a bit. This year, right now, we reran a little more, and yeah, a lot more of California has come into view. So I'm keeping my eye on that very carefully. Ditto with the Snake River Plain in Idaho, a lot more pink. In general, this tells us we're expecting more wildfires. And you ask, well, why is New Mexico all that green? Well, it has not been a productive year for herbs. Check. The percent change is low. Check. It has been droughty, so okay, I'll give you some score there. But keep in mind, too, we're not looking forested regions either. So these concepts I've shared with you primarily only apply in non-forested regions. So you have to take it with a grain of salt. Okay, here's where it gets interesting to me. When we filter and use tools to tell us where the fuels are, in this case, 600 pounds. I'm giving everybody the benefit of the doubt here. We're going from 800 to 600. The gray areas that just flashed on the screen are watersheds that are 600 pounds or less. Because we generally found somewhere between 600 and 800 pounds, we don't see large wildfires. And you say, well, you're Silver City, New Mexico right now. You just had a large wildfire event. Yes, but it's primarily a forested environment. So this only applies in primarily the non-forested areas. Why do I choose that value? Okay, let's study this map for a little bit, and then we're going to move on past the cake. I want to talk about threshold behavior and how we use these tools to tell us where the likelihood of wildfire is pretty low. So the tan areas are areas that have, on average, over time, 1984, 2024, greater than 600 pounds per acre. So orange meets the threshold. The gray does not meet the threshold. How many of the fire perimeters from 1984 to 2024 do we see in the gray? Now, it's hard to tell at this scale, but just study it. Not very many. And in fact, it's like less than 6%. And take a look at Southern Nevada right now, and you see some fire perimeters there. So you say, aha, we caught you. Your threshold's stupid. It doesn't work. Maybe. But those are fires that occurred in 2005 when we had 1,200 pounds per acre of red brome and other herbs. So it greatly outstripped the 600 pound per acre threshold in those years. But on average, we don't get fire in the gray. There's not enough herbs to matter. So we're still working on vegetation type by vegetation type using LANDFIRE data, what these thresholds might look like. Why would anyone care? Because for anyone that works in predictive services, if we can offer evidence using LANDFIRE data plus these rangeland indicators that, hey, we don't think you have a fire problem this year. You're at 400 pounds per acre. And because it's been dry and you're past your growing season window, your cake is baked, you're not going to have any more. Probably won't have a fire problem. So that's why it's important. Let's move on to something else that may be more interesting to some of you. Recently, we developed, using our Rangeland Vegetation Simulator, which is a lot of computer code, not very easy to use, but a lot of computer code. This is not possible without LANDFIRE data. So what did we do? We took existing vegetation type and the height from LANDFIRE data, and we applied a whole series of allometric equations to estimate the tons per acre of shrubs. But to get the tons per acre, you have to have, of course, that's fuel. And because we have allometries that describe 1, 10, 100, and 1,000-hour fuels, different size classes. For example, 1 hour fuel is less than a 1/4 inch diameter. We've got everything you need for spatial FOFM because of LANDFIRE data. Existing vegetation type with existing vegetation height. And we understand from the LANDFIRE reference database that for a given EVT, existing vegetation type, what's the most likely species? For example, Intermountain-based big sagebrush shrubland, existing vegetation type. Take a guess. What do you think the number one species in the LANDFIRE reference database that is referenced in that existing vegetation type? It's Wyoming big sagebrush. So whenever we encounter that pixel, Intermountain-based big sagebrush shrubland, we estimate, because we have no other way to do it, we estimate that most of the time you're going to get Wyoming big sagebrush. And if we know it's Wyoming big sagebrush, and we know from LANDFIRE approximately how tall that would be, and we know from the Rangeland Analysis Platform approximately what the cover would be, we can estimate the carbon, the biomass, and 110 and 100,000 hour fuels for those allometries. Any of you interested in learning more about that, let me know. Why would we care? Well, let's talk about the Eaton and Palisades fires. We had one of our first tea leaves of this year, episode 1 of season 6. We talked about Eaton and Palisades situation. Why did it get so intense? And of course, there's many reasons. But the answer can come to us from LANDFIRE data and other indicators. So take a look at what we have. Eaton and Palisades fires are in the pink boundaries. The cyan boundaries, or that light blue, whatever color that is, are fires that have occurred in the last 20 years. What don't we see inside the pink boundaries? We don't see that cyan intercepting those pink boundaries. That means Eaton and Palisades fire hadn't had fire in 20 years in those areas. Well, what has happened in the last 30 or 40 years to shrub cover in those areas? Well, let's look at the squiggly line down at the bottom. That's shrub cover, but shrubs are fuel, especially in this case. Time on the X, shrub cover on the Y, they've gone straight uphill. There's a lot of fuel there. Also, herb yields in excess of 2,900 pounds per acre in 2024, a lot of standing dead. That's why in the 7-layer cake, we saw in Southern California, the most significant fire probability and problematic situations in our 7-layer cake last year was exactly in this region. So using that shrub layer, we dug down deeper, or the shrub carbon layer. Again, not possible without LANDFIRE. Take a look. So we have the Palisades fire with a mean of 13.6 tons per acre. Tons. That's a lot. Eaton, not so much. But this gives you a reference of what that would look like. So Eaton, 4 tons per acre, Palisades 13.6. Thanks to our good colleagues at University of Washington. Take a look here. So we have a picture of chaparral from that neck of the woods. The marker here is a meter. So the vegetation in Palisades and Eaton fire leading up to that looked very much like this. But get this. That's only 34 tons per acre. And you say, well, that's way more than the average you're showing. Yes, but that's an average. There were stands in the Palisades fire exceeding 50 tons per acre. So, think about that for a second. That's part of what led to the situation. Modeled fire behavior there was 800 chains per hour or more because of those shrubs. And again, we would not have been able to model that amount of fuel so extensively without the LANDFIRE data. I want to bring everything back into focus and talk about some of these active management ideas with targeted grazing that everybody's talking about. There's 2 brand new bills being proposed looking at targeted grazing. Okay, so here's our decision support system that we are building with some bipartisan infrastructure law money that was received, 2 years ago. We wanted to create a viewer, an estimator, a dashboard, if you will, a tool that gets a handle on fuel, fire behavior, risk, and treatments. So let's start at the top. First, we have to understand where treatments could even be legal. You can't just allow herbivory anywhere you want. So if we're inside of a grazing allotment, which is shown here on your map, it's pretty easy now. They've made the rules a little easier. But we also need to know, where's the invasive annual grasses? And I already told you, USGS provides us that data twice a month. So, good, we can plug that into our decision support, because the idea is to hit those invasives where we can and also make a difference on the fire behavior, but also the ecology. What about treatment optimization? We can't just let the cows go anywhere, or the goats, or whatever you have. So that's where Forsys comes in. Some of you have heard of Forsys, but what Forsys enables us to do is to consider budget constraints, project sizes, expected reduction of fire behavior, resource functions. In other words, if we get 12-foot flames against some resource we care about, is that going to impact it or not? And also, where are the invasive annual grasses present? Do we need to prioritize other resource benefits, like sage-grouse habitat, for example? What about wildland-urban interface? So Forsys can handle all these concepts. And we are dubbing this now Forsys with cows, affectionately, of course. But for those of you that haven't learned about Forsys, you can Google it. And we're doing a lot of work with Alan Egger and Michelle Day and those types of people on this project. We couldn't do it without their help. So Forsys is going to optimize based on all these constraints where we think the treatment should occur. So what about estimated risk reduction? Well, let's say, for example, through Forsys, we identified 3 areas here in red. Yep, these are priorities. We want to go there. How is this going to work, and what kind of tools do we have to plan the field treatments with targeted grazing? So I've zoomed in right here to the Montgomery Pass wild horse and burro area on the California-Nevada border. And what you see is available herbivory. In other words, the expected extent of where the livestock will be from our StockSmart.com application. Don't let the .com scare you. It's actually free because it was made in concert with partnership with university and government resources. So, of course, it's free. But this estimates where the livestock should be on the landscape based on topography and the location of the water. If you haven't checked it out, I think it will help you. It's a great teaching tool with your colleagues, with your partners, to understand the landscape you're dealing with if you're going to plan these types of treatments. The cows aren't going to walk up a straight cliff. Neither will the goats, neither will the sheep. So you have to factor that in when you're planning your field treatments. So we've got this fictitious field treatment here in black. Maybe Forsys estimated that's where we need to be. So that's the estimated distribution. And in this case, the cool tones mean we have a higher estimated distribution or intensity of livestock. Warm tones, not as much. Why? Because it's further from water, number one. Number two, it might be steep terrain. Okay, so that means your fuels are not going to be treated equally everywhere. So here's a screen grab. I plugged it into StockSmart.com. I plugged that exact polygon into the landscape. And it estimated for me how many cows, in this case, they're cattle, how many livestock, in this case, again, cattle, of a certain size would we need for how long to reduce the fuels by 50%. Maybe you need a 90% reduction of fuels to get that risk down to, say, 5% from 100%. But that's where the project partners come in and you talk about that together. StockSmart will help you plan for all those different contingencies, like how much shrubs are they going to eat? If they're cattle, probably not very much. If they're goats, probably quite a bit. So that can all be factored in with StockSmart. So going back to our fictitious example here, you're not going to get the livestock to eat everything uniformly. So let's take a look at what this means. We start on the top with a LANDFIRE fuel model scenario, top screen. Okay, pay attention to the white circle and the creamsicle circle, or maybe it's orange, but you see what I mean. So then we go down to fuel reduction. Cool tones, we get more fuel reduction because the livestock will stay there more because it's not as steep and it's close to water. So then follow and go down to the modified fuel model slide at the bottom. Same color scale. What has happened? Well, in the orange circle, that happens to be 141. So that's an SH1. This is from LANDFIRE data. SH1, a shrub model, a low intensity shrub model. The top, we see a lot of the SH1. The bottom, we see a lot of SH1. Why didn't it change? Well, take a look at the fuel reduction expectation based on livestock distribution in the middle. It's red. That means that's too far from water. It's not going to work. You need to get some water there if you want them to change that fuel model. Also, we modeled cattle. They going to eat those shrubs? There's a lot of sagebrush in this area, I know. They might nibble some of the bitter brush, but by and large, less than 2% of shrubs in the diet. You want to change those fuel models there? Cattle aren't going to work. You need something else. Maybe goats. Who knows? In either case, that's how these tools play together. The white circle, a lot of jello moved on the plate. What happened? Starting at the top, what do we see a lot of? We see a lot of 101 and 121 and 122. So GR1s, GS1s, and GS2s. At the top, that's what we see. But in the middle, cool tones. That means a lot of animals are going to be camped out there and eating for a while. Well, they removed 50% of the herbaceous material because we told the program to estimate it. What happened at the bottom? It turned black. That's a 183. It's a timber litter model. Why? Because livestock removed all the herbaceous material. So that's the flow of and the idea behind coupling these tools together, StockSmart plus LANDFIRE fuel data, to understand what these fuel treatments can do on the landscape. I hope that makes sense. Finally, here's some tech resources you might have an interest in. Fieldcast.net, Rangeland Technology Summit that occurred 3 years ago during COVID. We talked about a lot of these tools in depth. I think there was 35 tools. The Art of Range podcast is another good one where they talk about fire, fuels, tools, and others. That's from Washington State University. Tip Hudson, he does a great job. I think he's up to episode 700 or something. Anyway, it's good to tune into that. The Geofencing Summit. So that happened, I believe, in 2023. That's something we put on to understand how geofencing can be used to support some of these fuel treatments. You can Google it. You should find it. If not, let me know. I told you about the tea leaves where we talk about the 7-layer cake a lot and also herbaceous dynamics. And finally, I'll make a plug for the Climate Change Adaptation Library. For any of you looking at climate change and adaptations and vegetation management and looking into the future, the Climate Change Adaptation Library is a great place to start to get your project partners on board.
Jim had a question, and I'll start it off. Do you have a measure of who is using these tools? Sort of a picture of the user community overall?
Yes. The Rangeland Analysis Platform, at least in the non-forest domain, is becoming almost common vernacular amongst range managers. Probably 60% of the range cons I deal with on a regular basis use the Rangeland Analysis Platform. There you go. Sarah just pops up. 24,000 users a year. That's incredible. So, yeah, so that. StockSmart, in a year and a half, we've probably got, I don't know, probably 1,000 registered users. Or no, 700 registered users and about 1,200 projects, plus or minus. And you can share, which, by the way, Rangeland Analysis Platform data help inform StockSmart about herbaceous pools and things. So that's that. As far as the other stuff, like the invasive annual grasses, I don't really know, but it should increase because it's wonderful.
So Matt, I'll ask a follow-up since I don't see anything else in the chat. Where are these tools and platforms hosted, and what about their future? Who's going to be there to maintain and manage them?
Well, the invasive annual grass is tricky to get to. You got to go through 15 different drop downs to get it, but it's wonderful data. It's also on Google Earth Engine, I believe, so you can find it there, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, Rangeland Analysis Platform, you can just do rangelands.app or Google the full name. The Rangeland Production Monitor, you can Google that too, or Fieldcast. It's on fieldcast.net, and you can go there. StockSmart.com is at StockSmart.com. And we've talked a long time with RMA Dashboard, like let's say Rick Stratton and these people looking at predictive services and other things, trying to get a landing spot for a lot of these things, but easier said than done. Regards to the future of everything, some have brighter futures than others, and I can't tell you what those are because I don't know. And yeah, it is possible this might be my last broadcast as a federal research scientist. So we're looking at a variety of opportunities. In either case, no matter what happens, I'll still be able to work with all of you extensively in the future, probably in a different capacity.
Meg asked, to what degree are folks using the non-forest toolkit in early seral forest and post-high severity fire in forested stands? She's keen to learn more for that open stage.
Hi, what I meant was the layer cake approach. Sorry, popping in. So I was using that toolkit loosely of thinking, okay, we've got all these really interesting and valuable rangeland tools, and then we have these forested scenarios and situations in dry forest setting where we've got that open sort of young tree, sort of sometimes sagebrush, different species of sagebrush, lots of grasses in that mix, and thinking about the analogs and gosh, how do we build up the intuitions for using the rangeland toolkits within those young post-fire forest settings, particularly if they're in a state of transition or transformation, depending on sort of where they sit in their climate space and adaptation space, in terms of our uncertainty about what trajectories some forests on the edge might have in the context of a changing climate. Sorry, a little bit of a broad space there, but I'm thinking of these post-fire forested communities as really being very much akin to a lot of what we're talking about here for rangeland, and wanting to do some crosstalk there.
Well, when we start talking about projecting forward, there's an more expensive answer, and then there's cheaper answers. But the more expensive answer would be to calibrate your state transition models that have been carefully thought out, or through the disturbance response groups, let's say, using Rangeland Analysis Platform data to give us a status check of where we're at. So decrease trees, increase shrubs, and you can fast forward those models using that approach based on climate expectations. For example, this is the expensive answer. In the case that I just mentioned, we may find that the climate future suggests that tree regeneration may not be possible because it's too dry and we don't get the snowpack for, let's say, those pea pine to occur. And that could be a box in one of your models that you work together with your partners to figure out. That's an expensive answer. It's not that easy, but it'd be a damn good one, I think. The cheap answer would just be to monitor. And if I was doing it, I had to do it tomorrow. And we do this. We talk to the range managers about this, like the IPNF example, the Idaho Panhandle National Forest, where the trees were going straight up and the herbs were going straight down. That was all Rangeland Analysis Platform. And people say, well, God, I've looked at the RAP data and I don't really like the fact that it's a 10% cover. We think that, that's hogwash. It's really 20% cover. Who really cares? If it's going straight down, that's still telling you something. So you got to take it all with a grain of salt and use it what it's best at. That's the cheap answer, is use the Rangeland Analysis Platform to give you a starting point.
Yes, just wanted to say, very helpful first step in thinking about where are these crosswalks in tools across these different settings. So thanks for that.
Yeah, Meg, have you ever used the LCMS Landscape Change Monitoring Service?
No, not yet. Not yet. That's a good one.
Well, it's had a lot of money and time and people, and it's on Google, and I think that's a reasonable place to look at differentiating fast change, which occurs, let's say, with a wildfire, from slow change, which occurs from something like gradual replacement or beetle kill kind of creeping into your stands or something, hail damage over time, whatever it is. LCMS has the advantage in that regard with trees, I think, differentiating fast from slow change.
Okay, I'll take a look. Thank you.
Jason has a question, and Jason, feel free to come off mute to clarify anything, but I'll read it for the other users. Can you speak to connecting these short-term changes in rangeland fuels with longer-term trends? Thinking of problems getting stuck in local minimum.
Well, local minimum, I'm thinking back to my classic ordination, multivariate problems where, you're climbing down and you think you're really in the valley, but you're really quite high up. So generally speaking, it can be a technical problem, but also from what you're saying, it can also be an issue with a lot of what you're doing, like you said, with one of the thresholds. You're doing some export adjustment, you're getting a feel for the data. So I'm just generally trying to wonder about, okay, I see your rationale for adjusting these fuel models to reflect current conditions, but how far are you going to go with that? At what point do all those adjustments start to translate into a more permanent kind of adjustment of the fuel model? Let's leave it at that. I think that would be a good place to start. Thanks.
Well, I think what you're talking about is trends becoming so important that they change states in the vegetation that are irreversible. The state changes. And that, again, comes back to the idea of the state and transition modeling in concert with these tools. It's not simple, but it gives you decent answers. But what I can tell you is, I do believe we've changed states in so many cases. For example, since 2000, looking at all these data, the Rangeland Analysis Platform, the Production Monitor, putting everything together, we can find, at least as far as I can see, that at least 30% of the Western United States has doubled variability 2000 to 2024 compared with before, doubled the variability. So the highs are higher, the lows are lower. What does that mean? I think it means that in a lot of cases, there's a lot more annuals on the landscape that just really go crazy. It's either feast or famine, that are uncharacteristic of the system. But to really understand that question, have we changed states? That's a deeper conversation and would involve state and transition modeling, I believe. But you can definitely look at your area, zoom in on the Rangeland Analysis Platform data, take a look at the invasive annual grasses from USGS, take a look at productivity characteristics, and begin to clump those together and find areas where things are going up, down, or sideways. You could do that in a multivariate system pretty quickly, and it would tell a lot.
Tag on to that. Jason, first, thanks so much for your question. And Matt, thanks for that ecological long-term view on the question, which I was thinking of as well. A second tag on that I heard you mention, Jason, I'm going to kind of imagine what you were thinking a little bit, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like you were also wondering if LANDFIRE adjusts fuel models based on adjustments that they hear about or feedback they get from the community. So maybe on the Coconino National Forest, they're hearing that, the fire technicians are having to do a bunch of adjustments with the fuel model to make it work. So that's something I'm wondering if LANDFIRE folks want to dig into now, and if not, Jason, I'm going to follow up on that one because I'm curious about that. I don't think the LANDFIRE is taking, individual fuel adjustment information and making adjustments like annually or anything like that, but I could be wrong. And just curious if folks from the LANDFIRE team are here that deal with fuels could maybe address that. If not, I'll follow up.
I'm curious how different SPEI timescales, 6-month versus 12-month SPEI, affect fuel moisture differently.
I don't have a quantitative answer. As you know, there are systems like in WIMS, I think, and others. If you get an account, you can find out what the live fuel moisture values are looking like across the United States. So there are certain databases that will be available to you if you want to really study that quantitatively. So I don't have good quantitative data to talk about live fuel moisture, but I do know this, that the shrubs are responding, at least as far as we can tell. When we see 12-month SPEIs in, bottom out and stay there, like we've had in Arizona and New Mexico, especially the southern parts, the 12-month SPEI is a pretty good indicator that the shrubs can burn pretty well. That's a wimpy answer and not very quantitatively addressed. But if you want to study it, get your live fuel moisture data, take the SPEIs, bifurcate by LANDFIRE existing vegetation type, develop a statistical model, and find out. I do know this, too. We studied the relationship of many drought indices, PDSI, SPEI, SPI, the U.S. Drought Monitor. What am I missing? Oh, and several time frames of those, 6, 12, 3 years, 6 months, 12 months, and 3 years, blah, blah, blah. By and large, what we found is most of the sagebrush grass, sagebrush steppe communities, especially in the Northwest, definitely responded or was a better indicator of fire extent and growth than some of the other monitors. So SPEI was superior to those that we looked at. Take it or leave it. So it was more correlated with growth and the vegetation and fire extent than any of the other models. And PDSI was the winner, but only in southern Arizona. Don't ask me why. But SPEI, on average, was a better explainer of where the jello is moving on the plate.
Michelle has a question about soil composition. Not sure if that's something you could answer or direct her to a certain resource, but curious how or if soil composition affects burning.
I'm not an expert, but if you think about what's happening in Canada and to the north, Alaska, obviously, when we encounter more peaty types of soils, those fires, I think a lot of the fires in Canada, part of the reason they're continuing is because of the soil and because of the peat and because of these relations. They just kind of skunk around for the longest time. And as you know, smoldering combustion is really hot. So that's one way I would answer it, is to say that when we think about peat, it's a big deal. The other thing I would say is, as you know, the soil composition greatly affects the types and amounts of vegetation that can occur, which in turn affects the fire behavior and fire effects. But that's the extent of my knowledge.